Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I thought I would sit down and do a reading update. I have been noticeably or perhaps unnoticeably absent here for the past month. On Sunday, I got back from a 2.5 week holiday out of the country, visiting family in New York State, and I spent most of those 2.5 weeks doing not much else apart from spending time with family and, of course, reading. And I read, I don't know, 5 or 6 books on my holidays. Most of them aren't here with me because I made a last minute decision to pack up some of the books that I'd read and some of the books I'd bought and mail them back to myself. And so I'm waiting on that box to arrive in the post box. But I did bring a few of the ones I purchased at this little shop called the Book Vault in Endicott, New York, as well as a couple of the ones that I had already been reading back with me in my suitcase. And one of the first books I picked up on my holidays was Tour of the Hebrides with Dr. Johnson by James Boswell. This is just a tiny little Collins volume that I had picked up secondhand here in Ottawa shortly before my holidays. And as you can see, I sticky noted it a little bit, passages I wanted to return to. And this is just Boswell's diary of the couple of months that he spent with Dr. Johnson traveling in Scotland, specifically through these islands, which are called the Hebrides. And I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. I had to sort of look up on a map exactly where they were. But it's, along the same lines of some of Boswell's other writings about Johnson, his life of Dr. Johnson. And it's just, an account of where they went, who they stayed with, conversations and whatnot. It's quite a relaxing read. Nothing groundbreaking or earth-shattering here. Just travel literature. And I thought, since I was traveling, I would read some travel literature as well. Although I certainly wasn't doing anything quite as strenuous as what they did on some days. And I did not get stuck at sea because of bad weather or, trapped on an island for several days because of bad weather as they did. And while I was in New York, at the Book Vault in Endicott, I came across 3 volumes of Ruskin's works. This is Sesame and Lilies, and there's a couple of other works in here, Unto This Last, and then it's just titled Etc. And this volume is a little bit warped, but despite being warped, that is not wear from being read, because I had to go through with a knife and open several, probably 24 to 30 pages inside this book, so it had obviously never been read in its entirety. But so far, I've read through Sesame and Lilies, and this is my first experience with Ruskin. I've been enjoying it. Their lectures, educational, instructive. He talks a bit about, education, women's education. What women should be educated for, and although he still definitely has the views of his time, men and women are different. Women's sphere is the home. He does have what were probably quite progressive ideas about women's education for the time, because he thinks that women and people in general, children in general, should be allowed to follow their own reading tastes. They should have free range of the library. You shouldn't be, restricting bad literature, because what's bad, a smart person who's been raised right is going to figure out for themselves that it's bad. And, they may not read things like that again. It may serve a lesson in and of itself to read, one bad book. And he thinks that, women should have almost the same kind of education as men, but more generalized. They don't need to become an expert on subjects. Rather, it's about understanding the perspectives and the emotional side of things. And he definitely sees women as needing to educate themselves in order to support the men in their lives, but at least he's not taking that very traditional view where women should be sheltered and should only read certain things and should focus on religion. In fact, he has some quite strong views on women reading theology. He says that it's idle women who read too much in theology and then think they can interpret the Bible themselves, and they spend too much time thinking about God and religion rather than participating in life and doing useful things with their time. And I wouldn't say it's particularly applicable to us today, but it is entertaining, and I think there are nuggets of wisdom here and there that are interesting and could be taken into everyday life. And then he gets into some political economy, and I would guess he is responding to Adam Smith, to some of these ideas about capitalism that are emerging at the time. And he is completely rejecting this notion that people are only selfish and profit driven. Rather, he's saying, there's good things in human nature, there's good things in society that contradict this idea that everyone's prime interest is their own profit. And that's about as far as I've gotten in there. There's a few more essays in here on political economy, and then there's some stuff later on. There's something called Athena in the Heart and the 19th Century, so I'll travel on into that. And there are two other volumes. This is the one I was interested in because I had been reading something else recently where it was mentioned, and so I was interested in this one. But I picked up two others as well, and I'm not remembering the titles just now, but they're over there on the shelf, and they were a little bit more than this volume because, as we can see, this volume was crushed on the shelf or something. And then in addition to the Ruskin, I've been slowly working my way through volume 1 of George Orwell's Essays, Journalism, and Letters. This is 1920 to 1940. It's part of a 4-volume set of essays, journalism, letters, everything publishable that is not his major novels. And I picked this up specifically looking for his essay on working in the bookshop. And then, of course, there's a lot of other great stuff in here as well, including pieces of journalism that he wrote about, being a hobo, as he calls it, being homeless on the road, pieces about, coal mining and that sort of thing. And he's kind of, bouncing around the world. He spent some time, of course, in Burma, in India too, and some time in Paris, and then of course back to England. And I think I'm about 1938 at this point, and so things are about to get really interesting. What I did not know is that George Orwell was a pen name, and his birth name was Eric Blair. And so he was writing under George Orwell, but of course he's signing all his letters, Eric Blair. And he went off to fight in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, and he came home after being shot through the neck. And he writes about it very casually, but also understands, it's a miracle that he survived, because it was, somewhere in his throat. It was a through and through, and it managed not to hit any major arteries. And he says, apart from, his voice being a little bit off, he's perfectly fine. And so he goes back to England after, participating in this Spanish Civil War. And I admit I don't quite understand, all the specifics and the politics of the Spanish Civil War. I was looking up, the specific group that he was fighting with, and it seems that the group he was fighting with started out, as part of this group of communists and socialists and whatnot, and they were eventually rejected as being Trotskyists, Trotskyists. And I'm just realizing I've read that word many times and never pronounced it out loud. But they were considered, counter to the cause they thought they were supporting. And if he hadn't, fled just at that time after being wounded, he probably would have ended up in prison with a lot of his friends who had been fighting there. And I think it's interesting to learn that he had, went to participate in that conflict, especially in light of some of his later, more political writings. And let's see, where am I at right now? I am at 306, one of his reviews, Trials in Burma by Maurice Collis. And I think, as I said, we're in 1938. Yeah. So some of the letters here are from February of 1938. And in some previous letters, he had been lamenting about some articles and reviews that he'd submitted for publication to some English publications in the United Kingdom, and how they'd been rejected for not fitting with the political views or the narrative that the media in the United Kingdom was, pushing for the Spanish Civil War at this time. And he says, it was rejected because it didn't fit with the editorial views. And then, someone from this one publication comes back and says, well, no, that's not what happened at all. We had already published so many articles on this. And then, he counters with a letter with proof where they tell him, this is the reason why we didn't publish it. And he writes back saying, given our disagreements here, I won't be pursuing this relationship with your publication any longer. And I'll be interested to see, how his views shift when the Second World War officially breaks out, because he's had some commentary already about, Hitler and the developments in Europe. And obviously he was someone who was very politically aware. But I'll leave it at that for now. I'm going to continue to work my way through the Ruskin and the Orwell. I did not take the Memoirs of Casanova that I'd been reading earlier in the summer and in the spring with me, just because the bulk of that book. But we'll see. Maybe I'll return to that soon. I'm in a very, jumpy, all over the place mood with my reading right now. But I will leave it at that, and I'll see you all again soon.